Welcome to Lesson 25E, School of Bible Believers. In Lesson 25, we've been going over Satan's system of religion. Last time we covered about how he developed that Queen of Heaven, where basically God had said that in Genesis 3:15 that it would be the seed of the woman who would bruise Satan's head. And so Satan then makes the worship about the woman rather than the seed. And he exalts the woman as the Queen of Heaven. And we talked about that last time, specifically getting up to the time where in Genesis chapters 10 and 11, under the kingdom of Babylon, you had Nimrod married to Semi-Ramses and having her being worshipped as the Queen of Heaven. Well, today what we're going to do is we're going to just give a basic overview pretty much of Satan and what he does in those first 12 chapters of the book of Genesis, and then going on after that, just a general overview of how he attacks Israel, God's nation, after that. And then once we get past that section, then we'll go more in detail both on the Queen of Heaven, Satan as the king to be worshipped as the sun god, and we'll go more over of how he got Israel to fall into that Baal worship and Ashtaroth worship. But right now, I just want to do a general overview. If you go over to Romans chapter 1, Satan understood the information that's given in Romans 1, and he used that information to try to build up, get really the whole world to follow him, so that if he could destroy the seed of the woman, or he could destroy the royal line from the woman, infiltrate it with his seed, then it wouldn't be a pure seed and God's plan would not work. There could not be a pure royal seed of the woman to be able to bruise his head if he could destroy that seed. And he understood what is given in Romans 1, that the way man destroys himself is through sexual sin. And we went over that in detail in Lesson 23, so I won't go over it in detail here today. But you can just, in short, you can see from Romans 1 and verse 19 and 20, there it says that man, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So the way God reconciles man back to himself is by, of course, through the seed of the woman, but also because of the free will of man. Man has to make the choice to believe the gospel. And so God shows himself to every man who's ever been born. But man in his pride tries to get rid of the knowledge of God. So one way Satan is going to try to attack man is to keep the seed of the woman line from being pure, to infiltrate it with Satan's seed. But also, even if that fails, if Satan can get man not to believe God and his word, then even if the seed succeeds in bruising Satan's head, Satan won't be destroyed if there aren't any people to believe the gospel. There won't be anybody saved. So, and here we see that some man knows of God. But verse 21 says, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. So the first step that man does, Paul told the Corinthians that all sin that you do is outside of your body. But if you, except for sexual sin, fornication, that is a sin against your own body. And so the way you destroy that knowledge of God in your mind is through sexual sin. So when man becomes vain in his imaginations, the first thing he does is he engages in sexual sin with the opposite sex. You see in verse 24, wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. And then, when man goes further into depravity and getting rid of the knowledge of God, then he gives himself over to sodomy, sexual sin of sodomy. You see in verse 26, "For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one towards another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet." And then the result of that, when they get into sodomy, then verse 28 says, "And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind." So you see from verse 19 and 20 that man knows of God, knows about Him, but then eventually man's sexual sin leads him to the point where he does not retain God in his knowledge by having a reprobate mind. And the way that that is done is eventually it's through sodomy. So once a society is wholly given over to sodomy, then it's taking God out of their mind. And you can see that today in the United States. Most people in the United States, say 70, 80 years ago, most everybody would recognize God of the Bible is real and He should be worshipped. Doesn't mean they did it, but they at least recognize that. And today, now that sodomy has taken over in the United States, not so many people believe that anymore. They don't think there is a God, or the God of the Bible isn't real, or He's not a loving God, or whatever. They have these excuses, and they've gotten rid of God out of their knowledge. And so that's what Satan did, understanding that the sexual sin is the way to get God out of their knowledge so that people will not believe God in the gospel. Then what he did is he got the world. If you go over to Genesis 6, there is a progression from the fall of Adam in Genesis 3 to the point where you get to Genesis 6, where he says in verse 5, "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." Well, you go back a few verses and you can see the way that man got to the point where he was just only evil continually, nothing but wickedness. And God says in verse 7, "I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth." But verse 8 says, "Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." So God destroys the whole world except for Noah and his family. Well, the reason is because they had gone through that downward spiral of sin that's seen in Romans 1, sexual sin, to the point that they were committing sexual sin with devils. You see in verse 1, in Genesis 6:1, "And it came to pass when man began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God," so that would be the fallen angels, "saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." You notice from verse 4, the result was there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. So, back in Genesis 3:15, when Adam had sinned, God promises that He will bruise the head of Satan through the woman's seed. And so Satan says, well, if I can destroy the ability for her to have a pure seed by having fallen angels mix with the daughters of men, in other words, with women, and having these giants, then I can keep that seed from being born. And that's why God ends up destroying the earth with a flood, as He starts all over with Noah and his family, because that was the only pure seed line. So that was the way, really, the two things that have to happen in order for God to reconcile the earth and the heavenly places back to Himself is, one, the seed has to come to redeem man of his sin, and two, man has to believe the gospel to accept God's redemption as atonement for his sin. So in Genesis 6, you see that Satan has attacked the seed line to the point where God says, I have to destroy the earth, or else the seed line isn't going to be pure. But also, we saw from Genesis 6:5 that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. So Satan, if he can get the world to follow sodomy, since that is the end result that we saw in Romans 1:27, where when a society gets to the point of sodomy, they end up being given over to a reprobate mind. If Satan can do that, he really accomplishes both of his goals. One, to pollute the seed, and two, to keep man from believing the gospel, even if the seed line is not corrupted. Now today, it's even worse, the plan of attack with sodomy, because Jesus Christ has already come as the seed of the woman and has gotten the victory over death and hell and over Satan and his forces. So that victory has already been won, and what's left now is for man to simply believe the gospel. So the sodomy is a greater focused emphasis. But you can see here in Genesis 6 that Satan's built up his own kingdom through sodomy to the point where the seed line had been almost entirely corrupted, which is why God had to destroy the earth with the exception of Noah and his family. So then when Noah gets out of the ark, you can see from Genesis 9 that sodomy, you may say, well, that wasn't sodomy there in Genesis 6. Sure, it was a devil having sex with a woman, but that's strange flesh, spirit going with the woman. But you would say, well, it's not man and man or woman and woman. But evidently, while that was going on with the women, the reason I believe that the women resorted to that is because no man would sleep with them, because the men were involved in sodomy. And you can see that from Genesis 9, because once they get out of the ark, all there is Noah and his wife and their 3 sons and their 3 wives. But we end up seeing that Ham, who is one of the 3 sons of Noah, has a sodomite relationship with his father here in Genesis 9. And verse 20, Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. So he's naked there and drunk. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment. Now I believe in verse 22 where it says Ham saw the nakedness of his father, I think that means that Ham had a sodomite relationship with his own father, and then he went and told his 2 brethren what he had just done. And that's based upon what we're going to now read. As verse 23 says, and Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done unto him. See, if he just saw him naked, well, that's just something accidental that happened. But the fact that he did something unto him would show you that it was a sodomite relationship. And you see from verse 25, he said, cursed be Canaan, which ends up being Ham's son. A servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And it was a result of the fact of the sodomite relationship that Ham had with his father Noah. So you can see that sodomy was prevalent there at that time, such that Ham has a sodomite relationship with Noah because there's pretty much no one else he could do it with. And it shows how Satan had destroyed man's ability to believe the gospel through the sodomy. And he continues when you get to the next one is Babylon. And we don't really have the details there, but I believe when you look, for example, in Genesis 11, and it says in verse 6, the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. For them to be one in their mind, that indicates sodomy was prevalent, because For anybody who knows, if you've been married to a member of the opposite sex, you know that men and women think completely differently. You're not going to be of one mind. You may be one flesh through the sexual act, but you're not one mind because you think differently. The fact that the people is one shows that they had a religion, as we talked about last time with Semi-Ramses being the queen of heaven, worshipped as such, and Nimrod being reincarnated as the baby born Tammuz, and we talked about that last time. So through that religion they ended up promoting sodomy, and that's how the people became as one. And Satan will end up building up kingdoms with sodomy throughout history. We don't really have we're not going to go into that right now, because like I said, in lesson 23 we went through a lot of the we went through the sex and marriage thing there. But later on with Lot, you have Sodom. That's where the term sodomite comes from, the sodomy that was going on there. And the Bible mentions that Israel ended up getting into sodomy, and that their sin of sodomy was like the sin of the people who were in the land before them, which was the land of Canaan. And Canaan, remember we read in Genesis 6 about the giants that were created in Noah's day, and it said in verse 4 that there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. The after that is a reference to the giants that were in the land of Canaan. So what God ends up doing at Babylon, when you had the people as one in Genesis 11, first off in Genesis 6, the whole world is united against God through sodomy, and so God says, I'm going to destroy the earth. Genesis 11, the exact same thing happens, but God says, I'm not going to destroy the earth this time. Instead, I'm going to create nations. So then Satan begins building a nation, which was Canaan, that was not unlike what the world was like in the days of Noah and the flood. So there were giants in the earth as a result of devils having sex with women to create these giants. And in the days of Canaan, in the land of Canaan, when Israel went there, like for example in Numbers 14, when it talks about them being, when God sends out the spies to go to spy out the land to see how they're going to take the land, the report comes back about how the people in the land there are giants. Actually, it was in Numbers 13 that they were sent out. And you can see how great it is there. Let's see, in verse 33, Numbers 13:33. There we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which came of the giants, and we were in our own sight. We were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. So there are those giants in the land again. And it has to do with the fact that, so just like in Genesis 6, if the devils are having sex with women to create giants, the reason they're doing that is because the men are engaged in sodomy, so that the women have nobody to have sex with. So they end up having sex with the devils and end up creating giants. That's what happened in Genesis 6. So the same thing happens in Canaan after Babylon. So it's happened again with Babylon. And so God ends up dividing the world into nations. And then Satan builds it right back up with the sodomy with the nation of Canaan. And there are the giants in the land there. So the same pattern, it just keeps repeating itself. And you can see I was trying to find a verse for you. I think 2 Kings 21 is what I'm wanting there, where it mentions the sin of sodomy that took place during in Israel, and it likens it unto the sin of that they had just followed the sin that the Canaanites had done in the land. Perhaps it's later on. But anyway, it's in there. I'm sorry, I didn't have it for you. It would take me a while to probably find that. But so you have Satan over and over builds up kingdoms with sodomy, understanding in Romans 1 that what that's going to do is going to be an attack against the seed line of the woman, and it's also going to keep men from believing the gospel. I mean, look at today. If I present the gospel to people before in America, say 50, 60 years ago, it's very common for man to at least believe he was a sinner. Now, if I present the gospel, he may not believe that. He may think he can do his own good works, obey the Ten Commandments or whatever. But it was very common for people to believe that they have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Pretty much everybody would attest to that. Today, no one will believe that because there is no God. And the Bible, the God of the Bible is just something that man made up. And there is no such thing as sin. We can just do whatever we want to do. We are our own gods. So there is no way that I can reach somebody with the solution of the gospel when they don't even see the problem of sin. And it's all because the knowledge of God has been taken out of their minds through the sexual sin that goes all the way down to the sodomy. And so Satan, knowing that, is the one who builds up these kingdoms against God that would have that sodomy in it. So he has Noah and Noah's day, then Babylon, and then Sodom and Lot's day, and then there's Canaan, and then Israel ends up following it, and then also in the Antichrist kingdom. Now, in addition to trying to build up his own kingdom with the Canaanites and with sodomy, again, God understands the promise of the seed of the woman. And if you look in, when God started, when he created nations in Genesis chapter 11, in Genesis 12, God sets up the nation of Israel. If you look over in Deuteronomy chapter 7, what God does is he narrows down that seed line. So first it's Eve, the seed of the woman. And of course, everybody came for her. She's the mother of all the living because she was the first woman, the first one to give birth. And so her child, and that person had a child, so all the way down, it's going to be coming eventually from Eve. It goes back to her. But then when you get to God dividing the world into nations in Genesis chapter 11, then God says it's going to be through Israel. So now he narrows that seed line from basically everybody all the way down to the nation of Israel. You see in Deuteronomy 7 verse 6, when God talks to Israel, he says, "Thou art a holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself above all people that are upon the face of the earth." And so if you go back to Genesis 12, that started with Abram. So in Genesis 11, when the whole earth was of one language and they were all one, united against God, God says, instead of destroying the earth like I did with Noah, I am going to divide the world into nations to create that national or racial strife among the different nations. And then God says, I am going to... And in fact, when we were over in Romans 1, it said God gave them over to a reprobate mind. The time when he did that was actually in Genesis 11, where he says, the Gentiles, I'm going to set them aside, and I'm going to keep them from getting too corrupt by creating racial division among them, to have strife among the races, so that they aren't united as one against God, as in Genesis 11 happened. And then in the meantime, God says, I'm going to build up my nation, the nation of Israel, and he sets them above all people. And you see that in Genesis 12, verse 1. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation," that's Israel, "and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." So while Satan attacked everybody and got them to all go against God in Noah's day, except for Noah and his family, then he goes right on and he attacks Noah's son to get him back into sodomy. And then he gets the whole world given over to sodomy and just united in their united front against man in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel. So then God separates them out as nations. He gives up on the Gentiles, and God starts his nation, Israel. And he says, "I'm going to reconcile the earth, or the Gentiles, back to myself through this nation of Israel, which I have set above all people, above all nations of the earth." Well, what that does then, and it tells Satan, okay, that seed of the woman now that started with Eve, now I can not only can I create my own nation, i.e. the Canaanites, and build that up to go against God's nation, Israel, but I can also attack the nation of Israel. And that's what we're going to do for the rest of today's lesson, is we're just going to briefly go over how Satan gets Israel not to believe God. You see, when God made that promise to Abram in Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3, you see right away in verse 6, just 3 verses later, "And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Sichem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land." It wasn't Canaanites. It was one specific person. The Canaanite was then in the land. It's a reference to Satan. Satan sees that God says the seed of the woman is going to now come through the nation of Israel. And so immediately, when God makes that promise to Abram, immediately Satan is there to attack Israel so that that seed line will not be pure. The next chapter, Genesis 13, verse 7. "There was a strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle." Abram had gotten a great abundance. You see in verse 2, Abram was very rich in cattle and silver and in gold. He had trusted the Lord, and the Lord had blessed him. There's no need to strive. You know, if you've only got a loaf of bread, you could see them striving over that because that's all they have. And if one person gets it, they live, and the other one doesn't, they die. But if Abram is very rich in cattle and silver and in gold, when you've got plenty, there's no need to strive. In fact, Abram says, verse 8, he says unto Lot, "Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee." He doesn't want a strife. He says in verse 9, "Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left." They got all this land. They've got all this cattle, silver, and gold. Abram does not want to have this strife. The reason there is a strife is because Satan caused it. There in verse 7, "There was a strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelt then in the land." Again, not Canaanites or Perizzites. It's a singular thing. It's a reference to Satan being in that land and causing that strife between Abram's cattle and Lot's cattle so that he can separate out Lot. Now, he knows Abram believed God. God called out. God did not give the promise of starting a nation and all the nations of the earth being blessed through him and making him a great nation. He did not give that promise to Lot. Now, Lot is righteous, according to what Peter writes much later, but at least initially, the guy who believed God was Abraham. Genesis 15, 4 through 6 says that Abram believed God, and he counted unto him for righteousness. So because God recognizes that you've got Lot, who is Abram's nephew, who isn't strong in the faith like Abram is, so Satan says, I'm going to cause a strife between Abram and Lot, and then I'll get Lot, and I'll end up developing the Sodomite program. I'll get Lot to go where the Sodomites are. We'll develop that, and then that way Satan has his nation, the Canaanites, really starting with Lot and that area that he is in Sodom, and then it will be the rival to Israel, the nation of Israel, that God starts with Abram. And so you see that the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelt in the land. That's a reference to Satan being in that land, causing that strife. And so it ends up that Lot goes into, pitches his tent towards Sodom. Verse 13 says, you see in verse 12, Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent towards Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. You see, Satan has already worked with the Sodomites to get them into sodomy. And that's how they were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. He gets Lot to split from Abram. Lot pitches his tent towards Sodom. And then it's not long before Lot actually goes and dwells in Sodom. Yes?
I just find it interesting that verse 12 says Lot pitched his tent towards Sodom, but then verse 13, and this is in chapter 13, Genesis 13, Genesis 13, verse 13. And it says, but then the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. So Lot knew how bad they were, but yet he still went there.
Right, because the land was well watered, it says in verse 10.
And he wanted, for his cattle, but, I mean, to me, this is a woman thinking, you go, hey, the land looks great, there's plenty of water and grass for my cattle, and you go over that direction, and you see what happens. I think I'd be, beep, 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 be backing it up.
Abram would have not have chosen to dwell there. That's what Abram did. That's not a woman's mind. That's the mind of faith.
Yeah,
Mind of faith says, I don't want to be with the wicked and the sinners.
Yeah, but I'm saying you would think Lot would have done the same thing.
Well, Lot was weak in the faith. He wasn't. Yeah. He wasn't like Abram, so that's why he did that, and that's why he pitched it. He did not dwell in Sodom at first. He pitched his tent towards Sodom. And then he ends up going into Sodom later on. So that was Satan's, the point is that was Satan's way of trying to attack the nation of Israel to get them into the sodomy by going after Lot, the nephew, not being strong in the faith. And then if you go on from there, of course in Genesis chapter 19, Lot is in Sodom. Verse 1, there came 2 angels to Sodom and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. So he wasn't just pitching his tent towards Sodom. He's actually living in Sodom. And God ends up destroying the city of Sodom with fire. They're not, again, there's sodomy. Just like there was in the days of Noah, the whole world was given to sodomy. Then the whole world was given to sodomy in Babylon. And now, because of the division of the world into nations, now it's just it's certain nations that are into sodomy. And God ends up destroying that nation. But that's where Lot was. So Satan had built up his kingdom with sodomy there in Sodom. And then, so that's how Satan attacks Israel right away. God gave the promise to Abram 3 verses later. The Canaanite was in the land. Then Lot comes along, the nephew. God blesses both of them. All of a sudden the Canaanite and the Perizzites in the land. Splits them up. And Lot goes into sodomy, and God destroys that city. And so now Satan will continue to build up Canaan, as we saw before in Numbers 13, that there are giants in the land, and that same pattern is repeated in Canaan. But Satan is also going to attack the nation of Israel and try to get them into sodomy. But first off you see, throughout Israel's history, there is going to be unbelievers. If you go over to Numbers 11, when Israel, 400 years after Joseph, God has Moses bring Israel out of Egypt, and they're in the wilderness. You notice in Numbers 11, verse 4, it says, "And the mixed multitude that was among them fell a lusting, and the children of Israel also wept again and said, Who shall give us flesh to eat?" It's a mixed multitude. God said in Deuteronomy 7, "I've set Israel to be above the people, a special people above all the people of the earth, for all the earth is mine." He told Abram in Genesis 12, "I'm going to bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you, and I'm going to make all the families of the earth are going to be blessed in you." And here's Satan infiltrating the nation of Israel so that you don't have just a bunch of believers out there, but there's that mixed multitude, those who are following Satan and those lusts. And that's why just 2 chapters later, when the spies go out to the land, 10 of the spies says, "We can't take the land." Only 2, Joshua and Caleb, had faith. Well, the reason is because Satan had so infiltrated the nation of Israel with his policy of evil that all of them ended up in the sin, except for Joshua, Caleb. Moses was a saved person, although he didn't go into the land. That's all we know out of 2 million or so people. Those are the only ones specifically mentioned that are saved. 3 people out of 2 million. Maybe there were more, I don't know, but I don't know who they were. They're not named. So there's that mixed multitude there. You go back to Exodus 32. Right when they get out of Egypt, they just saw the wonders and the miracles that God did to part the Red Sea, all the plagues that he brought upon Egypt that he did not bring upon Israel. Surely they would believe. But God had so infiltrated Israel Satan had so infiltrated Israel with his policy of evil that they are into idol worship. Remember, we talked last time about worshiping the Queen of Heaven, and Baal is the a type of Satan, and we'll get into that more later, a different lesson. But Baal is the sun god. The Queen of Heaven, Ashtaroth, is the moon god. The angels are the host of heaven. They were worshiping all of those things. You see in Exodus 32, verse 1, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, Up, make us gods which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what has become of him. You see the unbelief there. It wasn't Moses that brought him out of Egypt. God brought him out of Egypt. Moses didn't part the Red Sea. God parted the Red Sea. Moses didn't bring death of the firstborn. God brought death of the firstborn. Moses didn't bring plague of darkness, plague of locusts, plague of frogs, and all those things that were there. God brought those things. But they're involved with worshiping man. And they say, oh, Moses brought us up. And now we don't have Moses here, so we got to have a new God. And so then they end up making idols. This isn't some thought that they had. In other words, this had been in their minds. They were unbelievers all along for them to do such a thing. They end up making... Aaron ends up making 2 golden calves. In verse 4, he received them at their hand, fashioned it with a graving tool, after he had made it a molten calf, and they said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made proclamation and said, Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. So here he is, a molten calf that... Sorry, I put on your outline 2 golden calves. It should just be the one. The 2 golden calves come later under Jeroboam. But he basically, it doesn't matter. He got him to worship 1 golden calf. But we talked before about how, remember, Baal or Satan is the sun god. Ashtaroth or the queen of heaven is the moon god. That the host of heaven, the angels, represented by the stars, the sun, moon, and stars. Or even out there in the wilderness, Israel here at this time, they didn't just worship a golden calf. They were worshiping the sun, moon, and stars. They were worshiping the host of heaven out there. you see from Acts chapter 7. Because in Acts chapter 7, Stephen gives an indictment against the nation of Israel, basically going through their history and saying that Pharisees are uncircumcised in hearts and ears. They're unbelievers. And they're just continuing what Israel has done all along. They have been in unbelief their entire history. And he mentions there in verse 40, Acts 7:40, saying unto Aaron, make us gods to go before us. That's just what we read in Exodus 32. For as for this Moses, which brought us out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what has become of him. We just read that. Verse 41, they made a calf in those days, and offered sacrifice unto the idol, and rejoiced in the works of their own hands. Now notice verse 42. Then God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets. O ye house of Israel, have ye offered to me slain beasts and sacrifices by the space of 40 years in the wilderness? Yea, ye took up the tabernacle of Moloch. That's another word for Baal. And the star of your god Remphan. That's another word for basically the Star of David that's on Israel's flag today. And we'll go over that later when we get to it in a future lesson. Figures which ye made to worship them, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. The worship of the sun, moon, and stars, Satan's Babylonian religious system, was in Israel before they got to the promised land, out there in the wilderness. It shows that Satan had been working with sodomy and to get involved with the Babylonian worship system and the Queen of Heaven, and Satan as the sun god and the angels as stars, and worshiping those things. We saw that before in Genesis 11. That's what they were doing by building that Tower of Babel. Satan picks up right where he left off, and he had infiltrated it in Israel. He had attacked Israel to the point where they were doing those things. God said Israel is to be a special people above all nations, and I'm going to reconcile the Gentiles back to myself through the nation of Israel. So Satan says, aha, since God has specifically said Israel is my people, now I can focus on polluting Israel, and if I can get them to do exactly what Babylon was doing, then I win. Because then they won't reconcile people back to God, because they're not saved themselves. So Satan attacks Israel to keep the seed of the woman from being born, to keep from the Messiah from being born, and to keep Israel from believing, so that they won't reconcile the Gentiles back to God. Later on in Israel's history, after they get into the kingdom, they have a king, they have Saul, then they have David, then they have Solomon, and then when Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam takes the throne, but the kingdom is divided, where Rehoboam is over the two tribes of Judah, Judah and Benjamin there in the southern kingdom, and Jeroboam takes the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes of Israel there. And look, he does exactly what Aaron did. If you go over to 1 Kings chapter 12. He knows that the place to worship God is in Jerusalem, because that's where the temple was built. Solomon built the temple there in Jerusalem. They're supposed to go there. But Jerusalem is in the southern kingdom. Jeroboam is over the northern kingdom. So he's afraid all people go down to Jerusalem, and then they'll just unite with Rehoboam, and Jeroboam won't have a kingdom anymore in the north. So what he does, 1 Kings 12, verse 27. 1 Kings 12:27. If this people go up to do sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then shall the heart of this people turn again unto their Lord, even unto Rehoboam king of Judah, and they shall kill me and go again to Rehoboam king of Judah. Whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. There's your 2 golden calves. And said unto them, It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. That's exactly what Aaron said. And it said in Aaron's day that they worshiped the host of heaven, according to Acts chapter 7. Don't you think that's exactly what they did in the northern tribes of Israel when Jeroboam set up these 2 golden calves? Verse 29, he set the one in Bethel, and the other put he in Dan. And this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one, even unto Dan. And he made a house of high places, and made priests to the lowest of the people, which were not of the sons of Levi. Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month. So he makes up all this, he creates his own religion, basically. But you notice it has to do with golden calves. These be the gods which brought thee up out of Egypt. Under Aaron's day, golden calf, this be the gods which brought thee up out of Egypt. They worship the host of heaven, sun, moon, and stars, Satan, queen of heaven, and the angels. It's exactly what they're doing here. And we'll get into that more detail in a later lesson. I'm just giving you a basic overview of how Satan attacked Israel. The point is, he continues to attack the seed line from the time of Genesis 3:15 on. But that he can concentrate more on attacking Israel once God makes that promise to Abram in Genesis 12, knowing that Israel is supposed to be a kingdom of priests to reach the Gentiles, to reconcile the Gentiles back to God. And so Israel becomes corrupt to the point, if you go over to Jeremiah chapter 11, like I say, if you don't understand all this, I know I'm throwing a lot at you, that's okay, because we're going to go into more detail later on in later lessons. But I just wanted to get this overview done today. If you look in Jeremiah 11, this is just before Israel goes into Babylonian captivity, where they'd been in the land for about 490 years at this point. And it says in Jeremiah 11:13, "For according to the number of thy cities were thy gods, O Judah, and according to the number of the streets of Jerusalem have ye set up altars to that shameful thing, even altars to burn incense unto Baal." Baal, we went over before, is the name for the sun god. Baal Peor, called in the Old Testament. And then in Matthew chapter 12, the name Beelzebub is used for Satan, called the prince of devils. So if you're sacrificing to Baal, or Beelzebub, you are serving Satan himself. And they have, the reason they have all these altars and they're set up to Baal is because they're involved in the worship of the host of heaven. And they look at Baal, the sun god, they look at Ashtaroth, queen of heaven, the moon god, and they look at the angels as the stars, and they worship them. And we'll go over verses in a future lesson that shows you them doing all that. But again, this is just an overview. So you can see how by the time you get to 490 years in the land, Israel is just as corrupt as Canaan was, which was just as corrupt as Babylon was, which was just as corrupt as the world was in Genesis chapter 6. It's Satan's continual attack of the seed line, to the point that God even says, you go over to Hosea chapter 1, he tells Israel, because of them going after Baal worship and following Satan and worshiping the queen of heaven, God says to Israel in Hosea chapter 1 verse 9, "Then said God, call his name, Lo am I, for ye are not my people, and I will not be your God." Lo am I means ye are not my people. "Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered. And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, Ye are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, Ye are the sons of the living God." So God does promise to reconcile Israel back to himself, because he promised to bless all the families of the earth through Israel. But you can see at that point, because of them following into Baal worship and that idolatry, he says, you're not my people. You're following Satan. You're worshiping the queen of heaven. You're not worshiping me. And so because of that, God ends up leaving the temple. If you go over to the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel chapter 9, And this is just before Israel goes into captivity. In Ezekiel chapter 9, verse 3, it says, "The glory of the God of Israel was gone up from the cherub whereupon he was to the threshold of the house." So in the house of the Lord, there is the Holy of Holies. The throne is there, which is called the Ark of the Covenant. In that ark are the Ten Commandments, the manna, the rod that Aaron had, the budded. The book of Hebrews talks about what's in there. But God was to dwell on that throne, and on either, which was the mercy seat, and on either side of the throne was a cherub. So the cherubs with their wings covered, they protected that mercy seat from sin. So God would go there to the temple on the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, 1 day per year. The high priest would go in, make a sacrifice to atone for the sins of the people. But because Israel is now involved in idol and Baal worship, Queen of Heaven worship, they're involved in Satan's religion. God says, "You are not my people. I'm not your God. I'm leaving the house." And so that's why it says in Ezekiel 9:3, "When the glory of the God of Israel is gone up from the cherub, whereupon he was to the threshold of the house." What it's saying is that God's glory left the Holy of Holies, and now it's on the threshold of the house. And then you go down to chapter 10, verse 4. "Then the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub and stood over the threshold of the house, and the house was filled with the cloud, and the court was full of the brightness of the Lord's glory." So you can see he's going away. And then you go down to verse 18, Ezekiel 10:18. "Then the glory of the Lord departed from off the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubims. And then the cherubims lift up their wings and mounted up from the earth in my sight." Now the cherubims there, now we're talking about not the cherubs that cover the mercy seat, but the actual real cherubs. Cherubs that covered the mercy seat were just carved images. But the real cherubs that cover the real throne of God, they lift up their wings and mounted up from the earth in my sight. When they went out, the wheels also were besides them, and every one stood at the door of the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of the God of Israel was over them above. So now, God has left the building. God has left the temple. And then you go down to chapter 11 and verse 22, and we're going to see now that God leaves Jerusalem itself. Ezekiel 11:22. "Then did the cherubims lift up their wings, and the wheels besides them, and the glory of the God of Israel was over them above. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city, and stood upon the mountain which is on the east side of the city." So you can see how bad Israel has gotten by this point. And this is all as a result of Satan's attack of Israel, recognizing that the seed line would come through them, and God would try to save the world through Israel. So God tries to stop both the seed line and the belief of man. And it seems like he's highly successful, because now God has left. But again, the chance of redemption, though, is going to come through the seed, the Lord Jesus Christ. The seed of the... Sure, Israel isn't believing now, but the seed of the woman is still possible. If you go over to Jeremiah 31, remember in Jeremiah, we read earlier in chapter 11, that according to the number of thy cities were thy gods, O Judah. So you can see Judah has completely forsaken the Lord their God. But, again, all we need is that seed of the woman, the Lord Jesus Christ, to be born. And so God promises, he says in Jeremiah 31, he says in Jeremiah 31:31, he said, "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah." And you say, well, how is that? I thought Israel was in unbelief. They're not his people. They're following Satan's system of Baal worship and worshiping the Queen of Heaven. Well, it's because of the seed of the woman. You go back to verse 11. In Jeremiah 31, verse 11, it says, "For the Lord hath redeemed Jacob, and ransomed him from the hand of him that was stronger than he. The Lord redeemed Jacob and ransomed him from the hand of him that was stronger than he. The way that the Lord would ransom Israel is through the seed of the woman. So even though Israel is in apostasy, God says, I am going to still deliver Israel through the seed of the woman. You can see that promise again in Isaiah 49. Isaiah 49 calls Israel Satan's lawful captive. It appears that Satan's plan has worked. Before, God had destroyed the earth with a flood under Noah. Then God had to destroy, or he divided the world into nations in Genesis 11. And now it appears that one nation that God set up to reconcile the nations back to himself, the nation of Israel, is now captive to Satan. But again, because of the woman's seed is going to come and deliver him. That's how the Lord ransoms Jacob from the hand of him that is stronger than he. In Isaiah 49:24, God asks the question, shall the prey be taken from the mighty, or the lawful captive delivered? Israel is Satan's lawful captive due to their unbelief in following that Babylonian religious system. But thus saith the Lord, verse 25, even the captives of the mighty shall be taken away, and the prey of the terrible shall be delivered. For I will contend with him that contendeth with thee, and I will save thy children. And I will feed them that oppress thee with their own flesh, and they shall be drunken with their own blood as with sweet wine. And all flesh shall know that I, the Lord, am thy Savior and thy Redeemer, the mighty one of Israel. So again, there's Israel. It seems like Satan has won. It seems like he won in Noah's day, that he won in the days of Babylon, and Nimrod. He set up that Babylonian religious system. Then God divides the world into nations. He sets up Israel to be God's nation. And it seems like they're Satan's lawful captive. But God says, I'm going to redeem him. I still have the seed of the woman. And I'm going to redeem him as that seed of the woman. But Satan continues to attack. I'll just read this to you. I wrote down here just a summary of Satan's attack of Israel's seed line. And there are 16 points. We've went through a few of these. And as we go on through our lessons, we'll go into detail on some of these things. But I just wanted you to see how when God identified Israel as his nation, Satan attacked. First, we saw the giants in Noah's day, and of course in Israel's day as well. Number 2, we saw Lot in the days of Sodom. 3, we've got Hagar down there. She was the one who Sarah gave to Abram. Remember, God says he narrowed the seed line of the woman down to Israel. He says, I will make of thee, Abram, a great nation. So now Satan gets Abram to sleep with his handmaid Hagar, and he gets Sarah to do it, just like Satan got Eve to get Adam to sin. Satan got Sarah to get Abram to sin by being with the handmaid and trying to create God's seed when that's not what God chose. Then the next generation, you've got, actually 2 generations later, you've got Jacob and Esau. That Esau battles against Jacob there. The next generation, Joseph and his brothers arrest him, go into slavery. Well, not arrest him, but they sell him into slavery, and try to destroy the seed line that way. 400 years later, God sends Moses to deliver Israel out of Egypt. Moses sees an Egyptian oppressing a Hebrew. He kills the Egyptian and says, come on, Hebrews, God has sent me to take you out of Egypt and to bring you into the promised land. And they said, no, what are you going to do? You're going to slay me like we did the Egyptian? We're not going to go with you. So that first generation of Israel that Moses went to, they wouldn't go. Now the second generation, 40 years later, Moses comes back and he is able to get them to go with them out of Egypt, but they're in unbelief. They die in that wilderness. When Israel finally does get into the land, judges are appointed. In the times of the judges, you read that book, and you'll see them evil, good, and the book concludes where every man did what was right in his own eyes. That's Satan's attack of Israel's seed line there by getting them in unbelief. Then they say, we want a king. You've got the days of Saul. Saul's an unbeliever. Then we have Jeroboam. We just went over that. He made the 2 molten calves, had them go worship there instead of in Jerusalem. Later on in Israel, you have King Ahab coming up, and he institutes full-on Baal worship there in Israel. Later on, there is a woman, and we'll get to her more later on as we go through our study here in Lesson 25. But there's a woman, the Queen Mother. She was worshipped as the Queen of Heaven, Attila. And she is able to destroy all the seed royal except for one little boy who is saved. If that boy was destroyed, the seed of the woman would have been gone. Jesus never could have been born as the seed of the woman. Then, later on, when Israel goes into captivity, in Esther, the book of Esther, you read that, there's that guy named Haman. And he gets the king to decree that all of Israel is going to be destroyed. And it takes Esther standing up and then God fighting for Israel so that they can overcome their enemies, so that Israel is not completely destroyed at that time. The days of Haman there. And then when Jesus is finally born, about 500 years after the time of Esther, Jesus is born. Herod decrees that all those males 2 years and under are to be killed, so that they try to, again, Satan trying to destroy the seed line. The promised Messiah has finally been born, and Satan gets Herod to kill all the boys so that Jesus would be killed. But of course, God spares him. But then, so God spares him, and now Jesus starts his earthly ministry around the age of 30, and there's all this devil possession in Israel. You don't see that anywhere else. Well, that's because, again, Satan trying to destroy that seed line, corrupt it. Devil possession in Genesis 6 in the days of Noah, the giants in the earth. Devil possession in Canaan. Devil possession in among the Philistines. David slew Goliath. So now you've got devil possession in Israel during Jesus' first coming. And then you have Judas Iscariot betraying Jesus, and Satan actually entered him according to John chapter 13. There's 16 points right there. Satan's attack of Israel's seed line to try to keep the promised child from being born, keep him from delivering Israel, and then also to corrupt Israel so that they would not be a believing nation. So that's really, and it's all done through Satan's religion getting in there. We'll go into that detail more some other time. We'll stop right there. We're out of time. Next time we will go more into giving some more details about the Queen of Heaven. Then we'll get into some details about Baal, the sun god. And then we'll get into them worshiping the host of heaven. We'll see more details of how Satan infiltrates Israel, getting his religion in there with the worship of Baal, the Queen of Heaven, and the stars, worshiping the sun, moon, and stars. So we've already seen really how Satan gets that in there, what he does in Israel, and now we'll go into more of the details next time. Dear Lord, we just thank you for your faithfulness and your love toward us, that in spite of the sin and our pride and the unbelief over 6,000 years, you have still been faithful to save a little remnant throughout history, and that we know that your word will truly furnish us so that you can replace the devil and his forces in heavenly places with the body of Christ, and you can put saved Israel on the earth, and that you can rule and reign forever through the Lord Jesus Christ and through those who have had faith in what you have told them. All because you are faithful and that Satan is powerless to stop it. We thank you for your love and your grace and your faith throughout all of history. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so again, I know that was fast, but next time we'll go into some more detail, and hopefully it'll become clearer as we try to fill in those blanks. So join us next time.